On September 7, 1978, a Bulgarian exile named Georgi Markov stood at a bus stop on Waterloo Bridge in London, waiting to cross the Thames for his evening shift at the BBC. He felt a sharp sting in the back of his right thigh, like an insect bite. He turned and saw a man bending down to pick up a dropped umbrella. The man apologized in a foreign accent, hailed a taxi, and disappeared into London traffic. 4 days later, Georgi Markov was dead. Inside his leg, pathologists found a pellet smaller than a pinhead, a sphere of platinum and iridium, drilled with 2 microscopic holes, engineered to carry a poison so lethal that a dose the size of a grain of salt was enough to kill a grown man within days, with no antidote and almost no way to detect it once it entered the bloodstream. Markov was not a soldier, a spy, or a politician. He was a writer, and the government that wanted him dead had reached across a continent and killed him in broad daylight on a London street using an umbrella as a gun. And for decades, they nearly got away with it completely. Georgi Markov was born in Sofia, Bulgaria in 1929. He trained as a chemical engineer before turning to writing, and by his 30s, he had become one of Bulgaria's most celebrated novelists and playwrights, popular enough that he moved in the same social circles as Communist Party leader Todor Zhivkov and was, for a time, treated as a favorite of the regime's cultural elite. That favor did not last. Markov's later plays grew sharply critical of corruption and hypocrisy inside the Communist Party, and by the mid-1960s, several of his works were quietly pulled from Bulgarian stages. In 1969, while visiting his half-brother in Bologna, Italy, Markov made the decision not to return home. He defected to the West, eventually settling in London and marrying an Englishwoman, Annabel Dilke. There, he rebuilt his career as a journalist. He began broadcasting for the BBC World Service and, later, for Radio Free Europe, 2 of the primary channels through which Eastern Europeans could hear news and commentary their own government suppressed. Markov's broadcasts, part of a series called In Absentia Reports, were unusually pointed. He described Zhivkov's inner circle from first-hand memory. The parties, the petty corruption, the personal cowardice he said he had witnessed among Bulgaria's ruling elite. To listeners inside Bulgaria, tuning in on smuggled radios, it was explosive. To the regime that had once welcomed him, Markov had become something far more dangerous than an exile. A defector who actually knew where the bodies were buried, telling everyone who would listen. Bulgarian state security, the Državna Sigurnost, did not have the technical capability to eliminate an exile living openly in a NATO country. The Soviet KGB did. Later testimony from a senior KGB defector, Oleg Kalugin, described a secretive facility tasked for decades with developing untraceable poisons and delivery devices for use against the Soviet Union's enemies at home and abroad. When Zhivkov's government requested help silencing Markov, the KGB is reported to have supplied both the poison, ricin, extracted from castor beans, invisible to a standard autopsy and lethal in microscopic doses, and the delivery mechanism, a modified umbrella rigged with a compressed gas chamber capable of firing a tiny pellet into a target's skin from close range, disguised as nothing more than an accidental jab in a crowd. The weapon was tested on a human being before it was used on Markov. On August 26, 1978, 11 days before the Waterloo Bridge attack, a Bulgarian defector named Vladimir Kostov felt a nearly identical sting in a Paris metro station. Kostov developed a high fever and was hospitalized, but survived. Doctors couldn't explain why at the time and treated it as a mysterious infection. Nobody yet knew the 2 incidents were connected. Georgi Markov had no idea that a nearly identical device had already been used 10 days earlier on a man he knew 300 miles away. On the afternoon of September 7, 1978, Georgi Markov parked his car near Waterloo Bridge and walked toward a bus stop to catch a ride to the BBC's studios for his evening shift. As he waited, he felt a sudden sting in his right thigh. He turned to see a stranger stooping to retrieve a dropped umbrella. The man muttered an apology in a thick accent, crossed the street, and climbed into a waiting taxi. Markov mentioned the strange encounter to his wife, Annabelle, that evening, a small red welt on his leg. Nothing more. By that night, he had a high fever. By the next morning, he was vomiting and unable to keep food down. He was admitted to St. James's Hospital in Balham, his condition worsening by the hour. Doctors initially suspected septicemia or a severe infection and struggled to identify a cause. His white blood cell count collapsed. Over the following 3 days, his organs began failing one after another, and doctors could do nothing to stop it, because they had no idea what they were treating. On September 11, 1978, 4 days after a stranger apologized to him for bumping an umbrella into his leg, Georgi Markov died. He was 49 years old. It was only after his death, when a pathologist performed an unusually thorough autopsy at Scotland Yard's request, that a tiny metallic pellet was discovered lodged in the tissue of his thigh. The first physical evidence that Markov had never been sick at all. He had been shot. The pellet recovered from Markov's leg was sent to Porton Down, Britain's Chemical and Biological Defense Laboratory, for analysis. It measured 1.7 millimeters across, smaller than a pinhead, made of a platinum-iridium alloy and drilled with 2 tiny holes in a cross pattern, clearly engineered to hold a small reservoir of a substance that would dissolve slowly into the body. Tests eventually confirmed the pellet had carried ricin, a toxin with no known antidote, extracted from a plant many people grow in their own gardens without a second thought. The moment the news broke publicly, French doctors treating Vladimir Kostov's mysterious August illness reread his case file. They X-rayed the site of his earlier injury and found an identical pellet, never removed, still lodged beneath his skin. Kostov had survived only by chance. His pellet had landed in scarred tissue that slowed the poison's release. He had been the test run. Markov had been the target. British investigators, working with almost no cooperation from Eastern Bloc governments during the height of the Cold War, could not conclusively identify Markov's killer. Scotland Yard opened a murder investigation that would remain formally active for decades, one of the longest-running unsolved cases in modern British history, built around a single microscopic piece of metal and the umbrella that had delivered it. Newspapers gave the case a name that stuck: the Umbrella Murder. After the fall of communism in 1989 and the opening of Eastern Bloc intelligence archives, Bulgarian and British investigators found documents suggesting the operation against Markov had been authorized at the highest levels of the Bulgarian government. In the 1990s, they identified a prime suspect, an Italian-born, Denmark-based antiques dealer named Francesco Gulino, who had reportedly worked for years as a paid agent of Bulgarian intelligence under the code name Piccadilly, and whose travel records placed him in London on the day of the attack. Gulino was questioned once, in Denmark, in the early 1990s. He denied any involvement and was released without charge. He was never arrested, never extradited, and never stood trial. Scotland Yard formally reopened the Markov case in 2008 on its 30th anniversary, hoping new forensic techniques might finally close it. They didn't. Francesco Gulino died in Austria in 2021, having spent more than 4 decades as a free man, taking whatever he knew about the umbrella, the pellet, and the person who ordered it with him to his grave. Georgi Markov once wrote that a writer's job was to tell the truth, even when it was dangerous. He kept telling it, in radio broadcasts beamed into a country that had banned his own plays, until the truth cost him his life on a London bridge. delivered through the tip of an ordinary umbrella that nobody standing nearby ever thought to be afraid of. Subscribe if you want more. See you in the next one.